Critical three-day conference on Africa's debt crisis is underway in the capital Lome. With debt levels reaching alarming heights, the meeting, organized by the AU Commission's Department for Economic Development, Tourism, Trade, Industry and Minerals, aims to find solutions to the crisis and its impact on African economies. High-stakes discussions are expected on debt restructuring, sustainable financing and pathways to economic recovery. Let's get more insights from Jason Braganza. He is the Executive Director at the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AFRODAD. He joins us from Lome in Togo, where the conference is taking place. Thank you very much, Mr. Braganza, for joining us. Now, the theme of this conference is restoring and safeguarding debt sustainability. What do you expect to come out of the conference so that it doesn't end up being just another talking shop?
Thank you very much for having me. And yes, a very important conference taking place here in Lome. I think three things we need to consider. We had a very powerful opening segment by two heads of state, the president of Togo and the president of Ghana, who gave very powerful speeches indicating just how deep the debt crisis is on the continent and the need for a renewed restructuring mechanism. And I think that political will and that political message should send resounding message across the continent that at the heads of state level, they need to take this situation extremely seriously because it is going to mortgage and challenge the development pathway for the continent in the future. The second one is that we have a number of central bank governors and ministers of finance who are deeply involved in engagements with institutions like the International Monetary Fund, who are charged and tasked with the debt restructuring. And as we know it right now, the existing debt restructuring mechanism under the common framework is not fit for purpose. This is a key message that also came out today on the first day of the conference from these ministers of finance and central bank governors. So hopefully, at the end of these 3 days, we will have some sort of commitment to move away from this common framework that's not working for Africa and towards a more intergovernmental, participatory process where both creditors, all creditors, and all borrowers can sit down around the table. And lastly, I think the
go ahead.
Agenda on debt restructuring does not an agenda on debt restructuring that does not undermine Agenda 2063 and the pathway to which our economic transformation is geared towards.
All right, so I'm keen actually on that political message that you talked about that was communicated today. We've had some staggering figures being thrown around about Africa's debt. So we have over 20 countries nearing or facing debt distress. What are some of the key strategies these countries should look at to manage their debt more sustainably?
I think first and foremost, at the heads of state level, we need to come together and start coordinating and having a coherent common message on what the debt crisis actually is on the continent. And hopefully this conference will give us that after the end of these 3 days and that political messaging that we have been provided with by the heads of state from Ghana and Togo. Secondly, it's very important that countries that are entering restructuring, Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, and now Cote d'Ivoire, that they ring-fence and protect public services to ensure that these resources are not diverted away from the much-needed development agenda in order to provide resources for creditors. And the third and final one is really to call out the ineffectiveness of the existing debt restructuring mechanism under the common framework that excludes certain creditors like multilateral lenders and certain types of private creditors, which sort of undermines the ability of countries to approach the common framework and get their debt restructured. So we also need to make sure that there's a correct environment for countries that want to seek debt restructuring, that they have that correct environment. And a fourth strategy would be to ask and request en masse, as 55 African countries, for a debtor moratorium or a debt service suspension with non-interest rate bearing whilst restructuring is going on, so that there is no crowding out of fiscal space towards much needed public services.
There's something you mentioned there about development, and it's usually a very delicate balancing act for governments. We have development on the one side and debt management on the other, and there's often a concern about the impact of high debt on public services. So how can African governments balance debt management with the need to provide essential services to their citizens?
There are three ways, actually. We've seen in Zambia, for example, they've introduced a debt to tax revenue ratio, which means that only a certain percentage of their tax revenues can be allocated to debt servicing. And what this means is that it frees up a lot more of the tax revenue that the government of Zambia is going to be collecting in order to invest in public services. Also, what we can see is that the tax policies that countries are going to introduce, these should not be regressive and should not be the cost of borrowing should not be transferred onto citizens in that case. And the third strategy is, more broadly speaking, is to improve the oversight on debt management in terms of the role of parliament, the role of the judiciary, and the role of debt management officers as well as auditor general officers to make sure that they're able to account for the borrowing and hold accountable government for the borrowing that it is doing on behalf of citizens.
So finally, as we look ahead, what do you envision for Africa's economic landscape in terms of debt sustainability?
I think it's going to be a very bumpy road. There's a lot more countries that are teetering towards the edge of a debt default. As I mentioned earlier in this segment, Cote d'Ivoire have just stood up and entered the common framework, which means that they're going to have a very deep fiscal austerity program under the International Monetary Fund. There are several other countries, for example, Kenya, that have had to reorganize their engagement with the International Monetary Fund to ensure that they do not enter to any sort of debt crisis or debt default or have to go to capital markets. Countries like Malawi. So it is going to be a very bumpy ride, and you couple that with the existential crisis of climate change, the political instability in many parts of the continent, and the insecurity across the continent. You realize that we're in for a very bumpy. We're going to have to rely still on borrowing, and economic growth is going to be very slow and very low as the cost of borrowing also continues to rise. And this is sort of confirmed by the International Monetary Fund's recent regional outlook for sub-Saharan Africa that it launched during the spring meetings in Washington, D.C. just a few weeks ago. So a very difficult road ahead, but with the correct political will, with the correct sort of institutions in place, the correct sort of coordination and coherence and strategy, it is possible to overcome this storm with a collective position, a common position on how we're going to deal with the debt crisis and not mortgage the future of our continent in order to service our creditors today.